Hi, everybody. This is Ted. Welcome to week 13 of our video discussions. So, I want to recap us off first with actually a callback to week 11. So, if you remember, then we sort of discussed a little bit of how the idea of a hidden curriculum can manifest um, gender gaps in education. And that sort of takes or manifests in the idea of masculinity and its the way in which it interacts with the expectations of school. And so it sort of creates a choice for boys in certain capacities to choose between social success and academic success. And I want to take this week to sort of come back to this idea a little bit with a study done by a UK scholar, Morris, and think about this a little bit more in a rural context. Now, if you recall, the last time we read a little bit about this, we were looking at more urban and suburban contexts. And then I also want to propose a possible way in which we might be able to think about solutions to this issue, which is through Paulo Freire's pedagogy. And pedagogy, of course, for those who are unfamiliar with the term, is uh, basically the way in which we teach, or it's sort of the study of it. So I want to start off and return to the sort of very central idea that I put forth at the beginning of this semester, that education is not a neutral process. And I think if we accept that, then the implication is that pedagogical practice itself is going to be a critical factor in producing positive educational outcomes. So that means teachers certainly have a substantial role that they can play to make sure that their students are able to be academically successful. Um, so let's start and do a quick summary of Morris's study. So we're looking at Clayton High School, which is a predominantly white, low income rural school in Appalachia. And Morris presents us with a stark finding, which is sort of confirming some of the other studies that we read earlier, that there's a substantial academic gender gap favoring girls in this school. Girls are dominating the top of the class rankings, and boys are overrepresented among those repeating grades and those who have no college plans. And uh, there's an additional sort of confounding factor here, which is that there's a sort of identity beyond masculinity. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But I think we have a quote here that I found that I liked, which says, girls don't think about fighting or think about hard work. They're thinking about office jobs, accounting, business, stuff like that. The easy type of stuff. So there's a sort of idea for many of the boys who go to this high school that um, doing stuff that requires sort of like intellectual white collar work is emasculating in a sort of way, or it's easy, and so they don't want to go for that. Um, and I think that shows or kind of reconfirms some of our previous arguments about this idea of masculinity being constructed around a physical toughness, but also in this case a carefree, rebellious attitude towards schoolwork and a valorization or reverence, preference, whatever you want to say, towards manual labor or blue collar jobs. And I think some of this is interacting with what Morris calls the redneck identity, which is a sort of proud, um, uh, white, lower class identity that many folks in the South and Appalachia have. Um, and it embodies a sort of opposition to elitism and intellectualism, I would say, in favor of sort of rough, tough, blue collar whiteness. And that also means that when we're talking about gender as performance, there's a sort of academic nonchalance that goes along with being a boy in this rural high school. And that means essentially that if you put in too much effort into your schoolwork, you may get ostracized, you may get called sort of, something homophobic or emasculating or feminizing. And I think the irony here is that the way in which boys are sort of upholding their masculine gender dominance um, in a broader economic context is actually helping to reproduce sort of class disadvantage, or it's essentially keeping them sort of lower on the social ladder. And I think this raises a lot of it raises a lot of questions. Um, but I think the first one for me that comes up is, why is school itself so easy for these boys to reject? What is it about school? And so I'm going to posit my own theory here, is that I think we can look at Freire's concepts, two concepts of education, the banking model and problem posing education, and we can see correspondence between the banking model that Freire is going to talk about and um, the hidden curriculum. If you go back to week 9, where we talked about the structure of more rural, lower class schools, which favor sort of like authoritarian rote performance. So let me go ahead and summarize both of Freire's two concepts. So Freire also is going to make the argument that education is not neutral. It's either a tool for liberation or it's a tool for domination. And those might sound sort of like very, very scary, very forceful, but you can also uh think about it as a tool for reproduction of kind of current social relationships, or maybe as a tool for people to question, or give them agency and think about things on their own terms. So let me first cover the banking concept. And for those of you who don't recall what the process of a bank is, if you guys have never walked into a bank, so uh, a teller sits behind a desk, and a depositor is going to come in with a certain amount of money. They're going to hand it to the depositor, and the depositor is going to take that and stick it, file it away. And so Freire is really describing a similar process in this first concept of education, which of course he is critical about, because in his view, an education for domination is one in which uh, the teacher acts as a depositor and students are the depositories, or they're the tellers. Now, what does this mean? So, the teacher is the one who has all the knowledge in this process. They have the knowledge. Students know nothing. They are a blank slate, if you guys have heard that term. That means that the teacher is the one who performs action in this process. The teacher teaches, the students are taught. The teacher is talking, and the students are expected to listen. And the teacher is the one who has creativity. They have agency in this process. They can think about how they want to frame their message, but the students are the ones who are expected to receive that message, to take it, and that means essentially in questions or in a theory of education, the teacher is the one who is the subject of the learning process. It's not about students. It's not about what the students are, what's going on in the brains of students. It's about what the teacher is doing. And so the pupils are basically objects as opposed to subjects, which is an important distinction. Essentially, in this model of education, students are thought of as passive, adapted, and manageable. And their creative power, their ability to question is supposed to be minimized. And Freire says this is serving the interests of those who wish to sort of reproduce the current social relations of society, without having people really wonder why anything is the way it is. And I would argue that is going on in many of the classrooms, even in our modern education system. So the alternative that Freire is proposing is his problem posing model of education. So, in this model, education is seen as the practice of freedom, and it's supposed to begin to resolve the contradiction between teacher as subject and student as object. So, that means in this model, teachers should be thought of as learners, and students should be thought of also as teachers. Everyone is supposed to be able to have uh, a say in the educational process. Everyone is supposed to be able to teach, and everyone is supposed to be able to be taught through the process of dialogue. Now, you guys might, when I talk about dialogue and the process of education, your mind might call back to an idea of a Socratic dialogue. And in some ways, this is similar. Um, uh, because obviously the teacher may help serve as a facilitator. They may be asking questions to help elicit things out of students, but they are certainly not attempting to be an authority in a similar capacity, maybe more of a facilitator. Um, the idea here is through the process of dialogue that the learning, the knowledge that is supposed to be created is done sort of from the ground up. Think of it sort of like Legos. everybody is working together to sort of like build up a Lego model. And so in this way, the classroom is built on communication and cooperation or co-investigation of specific ideas and and of the world. So Freire is giving us this sort of binary lens, a critique of contemporary types of education and a possible solution that he envisions. Um, and I think that we can see that this critique is still very much at play. If you recall week 9, our discussion of Anyon's hidden curriculum, the working class school trains students for the factory floor through rote mechanical work that emphasizes compliance and following procedures. Or it appears to. There appears to be a sort of um, authoritarian way in which the education process takes place. And so I think that the pedagogy in many of these rural schools is oftentimes appearing to be the classic banking model that makes school so easy to reject for boys. They're expected to be patient in listening objects. They're expected to compliantly receive knowledge about a world that is alien to their particular experience. And I think that the sort of passivity and subordination uh, in many classrooms is antithetical in many ways to the performance of masculine gender norms. And also the way in which sort of a redneck identity is conceived of in southern US and also in Appalachia, which is all about autonomy. It's about challenging authority. It's about asking questions and being independent. And I think obviously there's conflict between these two sort of competing um, expectations on boys. And so I think for many boys, academic disengagement or non-participation or rebellion is can often be a rational response, and complying can actually get you ostracized, like I said. So I think really interesting thing is that school is inadvertently reinforcing um, some of the masculine performances that lead to boys' academic failure. It's not just that boys are rejecting school, it's that the structure of schooling is rejecting them in a sense, or their constructed identity, their, the sort of components that they have been socialized into. And so I think, returning once again to our sorting machine metaphor that we've talked about these past couple weeks, I think we can see that not only does school work as a sorting machine on a sort of large scale, sorting people by class, sorting people by gender, it has a specific mechanism, and that's that pedagogical method that's actively doing sorting. It interacts with students in different ways. And the banking model of education is a particular method which um, pre-selects. Well, it's it's by it is, how do I say this? It is it incentivizes certain behaviors. um, so I think this gives us a really interesting way to look at the gender gap. All of this discussion, I hope, that academic gender gap in education is it's not about boys, peer culture, always. Um, it's also could be considered a crisis of pedagogy. It's a problem for teachers. What are we supposed to do about this? Well, maybe there's something we could do differently in our teaching. So I think we can see this sort of connecting a macro to a micro here, that stagnation in male educational attainment, particularly in the industrialized areas, often kind of corresponds with these specific working class schools which focus heavily on an authoritarian pedagogical style. And I think that Freire does potentially offer us a solution in a more engaging um, mode, which encourages students to actually actively participate in the learning process. Um, I think in I think in Freire's problem posing model, we can see that knowledge built through dialogue treats students with respect in a way that I think can be more empowering for boys and girls as well. I don't want to be, you know, arguing only from the point of boys, but I think it's an interesting thing for us to consider, um, that maybe we shouldn't be thinking about how to fix boys, making them necessarily like more compliant to the educational system, but to in fact make the way in which we conduct education a more liberating experience for everybody. So, thank you all. Hopefully, this was interesting. Have a good one. Bye.